Welcome, everyone, to Module 3 in this structured series focused on coming back to oneself and understanding identity after emotional abuse. In the previous modules, I discussed conditioning and the gradual process through which identity narrows over time in emotionally unsafe relationships. Here, today, we're going to shift focus. Rather than examining what was lost, this lecture will examine what remains and why identity is more often intact beneath adaptation than you might think. I want to start with a common fear. It seems individuals emerging from narcissistic abuse often express a particular fear. They worry that the self they once were is gone. It sounds like, I used to be decisive. I used to be warm. I used to know what I like. I don't trust any of that. They may describe feeling somehow fundamentally changed, and they assume that what has been lost cannot be recovered. So the fear feels like loss, but it's actually a misreading of adaptation and how identity functions. This leads me to identity suppression versus identity destruction. That feeling of identity loss that occurs in narcissistic abuse is, I think, better described as suppression, not destruction. Let's think about it simply. Through preferences. Many people say, I don't even know what I like anymore. But when they're asked to choose between two neutral options, let's say music and food, the choice is quick. That tells us that the preference system isn't gone. It's just being held back. Over the years, the nervous system learned not to show this, don't choose, don't want too much. That is suppression. It's not destruction. The same is true for emotional capacity. People will often say they've gone numb, but they still feel something deeply, let's say for a little animal, a child, or just a moment in time. The capacity is there, it's just offline. In other words, preferences, instincts, values, and emotional capacities, they're there, but they are inhibited by caution and restraint that's been learned in the relationship. Suppressed systems can reemerge. Destroyed systems cannot. It's so important to understand that. So let's go back to adaptation and the protective nature that we touched on in earlier modules. We looked at the use of self-silencing to reduce conflict, and we explored emotional restraint to preserve connection and anticipation to minimize rage. These strategies were not signs of self-betrayal, they were protective responses to an unpredictable environment. For example, someone may have learned to stay quiet, not because they didn't have anything to say, but because speaking freely led to conflict. Over time, silence became a safer option. That wasn't self-erasure, that was protection. The capacity to speak, it didn't disappear. It was temporarily set aside in service of safety. Importantly, adaptation doesn't erase underlying traits. It simply deprioritizes them. When the environment rewards caution, traits like curiosity, expressiveness, or spontaneity, they don't vanish. They simply are moved out of the foreground. So that's a good segue to discuss the evidence of what remains. Even during periods of identity suppression, certain elements persist. For example, many people describe persistent sense of unease and internal tension they just can't quite name. They may also think, why am I so uncomfortable when nothing obvious is happening? That discomfort is evidence. It's the signal of the value system that is actually still very active, still noticing misalignment even when expression doesn't feel safe. Or consider emotional responsiveness. Someone may say they've gone numb, yet they still feel deeply affected by injustice or the suffering of others, for example. And that reaction points to moral clarity and that it never left. It was constrained. So remember, the presence of distress itself is often evidence of intact values. Discomfort signals misalignment, not absence. To further our understanding of all this, we need to discuss the role of the nervous system. Conditioning actually alters patterns of response, not a person's core identity. For example, someone may leave a harmful relationship and expect to feel immediate relief, only to notice that they still startle easily. They may feel emotionally flat, or they just struggle to access joy. They might conclude that something else has been lost. But I think what's actually happening is physiological. The nervous system is still operating as though the danger is present. It hasn't received enough consistent safety just to stand down. But as safety increases, people will often notice these small shifts, whether it's moments of curiosity, a brief sense of ease, spontaneous laughter. These aren't new traits appearing, they're familiar responses resurfacing as vigilance softens. So when identity begins to come back, it's not likely to return all at once. Instead, it happens subtly. It might look like the individual noticing they don't want something and trusting that signal internally. They choose music without even overthinking it, feeling a flicker of curiosity about something that maybe once mattered to them. Because these are little moments, they're often dismissed as insignificant, but they're not. They're evidence that the self was preserved and is beginning to reassert itself. Reemergence, it doesn't show up with a big sign. It reveals itself slowly over time. They indicate that the underlying self was preserved. And while this reemergence begins, we know the individual can still feel very unsettled. When identity begins to reemerge, we expect to feel reassured, but it usually doesn't feel that way. It can be disorienting or even destabilizing. That reaction is not a sign that something's wrong. It reflects the fact that the nervous system learned over time that expression carried risk. When suppressed parts of the self begin to resurface, the system may initially respond with caution rather than relief. And in that sense, discomfort during reemergence isn't evidence of regression, it's evidence of transition. The system is recalibrating, learning that safety may now be possible. This is why recovery is so misunderstood. It's not an immediate return to who someone once was, nor a sudden release into action. It's a process of integration, allowing previously constrained parts of the self to reappear gradually without forcing them forward or demanding immediate clarity. Remember, early reemergence is quiet. It shows up as internal recognition before there's any external change. And because it's so subtle, it can be overlooked. But these early signs still matter. They indicate that the underlying self was preserved. For this reason, stability must come before action. The goal at this stage is not confrontation, explanation, or decisive change. It's consistency, predictability, safety. When stability is established, action becomes clearer and more sustainable. Identity doesn't need to be pushed back into place. It returns when the conditions allow it to remain. Learning to trust reemerging instincts, that takes time. Now, let's move into stabilization, because recovery is so often imagined as rebuilding, reconstructing a new self from the ground up. In reality, recovery is, I think, better understood as a release. Identity does not need to be rebuilt. What returns is not a new self, but a previously constrained one. As inhibition softens, existing traits, values, and capacity, they reemerge. At this stage, action isn't required. Awareness alone represents progress. Noticing internal responses, recognizing preferences, and observing early signs of alignment, they're meaningful indicators of recovery. Emphasizing stabilization over change reduces urgency and self-judgment, allows the nervous system to continue to recalibrate without being under so much pressure, and it supports recovery at the pace that is both sustainable and protective. When stability is established, action becomes clearer. And when action does come, it's more likely to be grounded, intentional, and enduring. This module has focused on continuity rather than loss. Identity suppression and narcissistic abuse does not erase the self, it conceals it. What remains beneath adaptation is not emptiness, but potential held in reserve until safety allows expression. The next module will explore how safety begins to reestablish internally and how trust in one's own perceptions starts to return. I'm Keil Hackley. I thank you for staying with me through this module, and I certainly hope to see you in the next, and I welcome your questions. Thank you, and bye for now.